is economics? Well, when I want to understand something, the first thing I do is I go to etymology. I go to what the word itself actually means in the history of the word. So the English word economics comes from the Latin word oikonomia, which comes from the Greek word oikonomia. Latin tended to borrow a lot from Greek. Oikos in Greek means home or household. Nomos in Greek means management. Put those two together, economics originally means household management or home management. So you may have had a class in high school called home economics. Well, that's a tautology. It's a sentence or a statement that is redundant unto itself. Literally means house management. But what is economics today? What are we coming together to study? Economics is the science, the study of how individuals, groups, and societies choose to allocate scarce resources. So that brings us to our next topic, which is scarcity. What is scarcity? Scarcity literally means that things are rare. They are finite. Now, we know a couple of things. We know from physics that matter can be neither created nor destroyed. It can only be transmuted from one form of existence to another. Now, depending on which theory you subscribe to and which theory you put more value on, the reality is we don't know if the universe is infinite or if it's finite. Now, we know for sure the observable universe is finite, and we know for certain that the amount of the universe that we can physically reasonably come in contact with at this point is definitely finite. So the reality is that all of our resources that we use in production are finite. They are limited in supply. And even if we had, for all intents and purposes, infinite resources, there is still a resource that is scarce to us, and that is time. Matter cannot occupy separate points in space-time simultaneously. You can only do one thing with your time. Even if you have unlimited resources to get things done, you only have so many hours in the day. So ultimately, because we all face scarcity, we all face trade-offs in decision-making. If I use this resource to do that, then I can't use that resource to do this other thing. And what we do as economists is we study how human beings make choices in a world where our desires are unlimited, but the resources we have to meet them are scarce, they are rare, they are finite. And so as a result, how do we make choices in the face of these trade-offs? Another set of concepts that we need to talk about to lay out the basics of economics, to lay out these economic fundamentals, are two things that go together: utility and rational self-interest. Now, these two things together are at the heart of how human beings behave and how economists model human behavior. So let's start with utility. We're talking about the actual benefit, the actual satisfaction we receive beyond just the dollars that we receive, beyond just profits. Now, yes, when we're modeling company behavior, utility is measured in profit. It's a very simple thing. But when we're modeling human behavior, utility is all the satisfaction we receive. So human beings pursue utility in our lives. We try to receive the most amount of utility that we can. Now, this gets coupled with a concept we call rational self-interest. When we say something is rational, we mean that human beings have cause and effect understandings of reality. When we say that something is rational, we mean that human beings have a cause and effect understanding of reality. If I do X, then Y will happen. And that we act on those expectations. Rationality does not mean we are correct. Our expectations can be wrong. Rationality does not even require that we are sane. For example, there's a thing we call the gambler's fallacy. Gamblers are people who have a mental disorder. Objective reality would state that if I flip a coin, there's a 50% chance it lands on heads and a 50% chance it lands on tails. If I flip the coin again, It's a 50-50 shot, it's heads or tails. If I flip the coin again, there's a 50-50 shot, it's heads or tails. So if I flip that coin 3 times in a row and it lands on heads, 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 a rational person, well, not a rational, and it lands heads, 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 a logical person, a sane person would say, well, the odds of it landing heads the next time is 50%, because that's how a coin flip works. It's a 50-50 chance every time. But gamblers have a mental disorder. Gamblers will say, oh, it's been heads 3 times in a row. Heads is on a lucky streak. There's a greater than 50% chance it comes up heads the next time. Or, you know what? It's been heads 3 times in a row. There's a greater than 50% chance tails is going to come up next time. Tails is due. And you see, that's a fallacy. It's illogical thinking. The reality is each flip of the coin is fresh. The prior incident has no effect on the future incident. It's a coin flip. The prior incident has no effect on the future outcome. It's a coin flip. But a gambler has non-logical, they have, for lack of a better term, insane expectations of cause and effect that are disconnected from reality. Now, does that mean that a gambler is irrational? No. A gambler still has a cause and effect expectation of reality. It's just not correct. So whether human beings are correct in our expectations or not, whether we are sane or insane, we still act based on our expectations of cause and effect, and so we still act rationally. Now let's put rationality in next to what we call rational self-interest. Human beings are self-interested creatures, and I know, there's a whole lot of philosophy out there and a whole bunch of things about convergent evolution and a whole bunch of things about human culture is built upon group sharing and altruism and all these things. But here's the reality. We know from study, we know from behavioral analysis, human beings act in our own self-interest. We do things that we think are going to be best for ourselves or things we think are reflections of ourselves. Oh, I sacrifice my life to save my family. Yes, your family. Or I sacrifice myself for the good of the community. Yes, your community. It's still an extension of yourselves. So let's put all of this together. Human beings are rational. We're deliberate. We have cause and effect expectations of reality. We use those cause and effect expectations in pursuit of the most utility, the most gain, the most satisfaction for ourselves. Putting all that together, that's how economists view human behavior. That's how we model human behavior. That the human being is going to use its rationality to try to pursue the greatest benefit for itself or that which it views as an extension of itself. So yes, economics does make certain judgments about human behavior. Now, the good thing is, we're scientists. We don't only just build models of this, we do tests of this, we do experiments of this. We know that human beings will pursue their own self-interest, and we're going to talk about all the myriad ways that that plays out in an economy as we move through this video series. The next major concept in economics that we need to talk about is marginal thinking. So when we say marginal in economics, we mean incremental, of the next. Now, the thing is, everybody thinks on the margins, whether we realize we're doing it or not. So let's talk simply first about benefits and costs. Now, we have benefits and we have costs. We have what we would call total benefit and we have what we would call total cost, which is, as the name implies, the total amount of benefit and the total amount of cost you receive from something. And then we have marginal benefits and marginal costs. The marginal benefit of something is the additional, the incremental benefit you receive from the next unit of something. The marginal cost is the additional, the incremental cost that you pay when you acquire another unit of that good or service. Now, that's a little abstract, but we're going to add one more concept to that I think will help this all make sense. So if we were to talk about the marginal benefits and the marginal costs of something, these are not static. They're not a fixed number. In fact, they change. More to the point, marginal benefits decrease as consumption increases. Marginal costs accelerate as consumption increases. Now, this produces an ellipse. If we graph out our total benefit curve and our total cost curve, our total benefit curve begins to plateau, begins to flatten out. Our total cost curve begins to accelerate, begins to become steeper, and that creates an ellipse between them. That ellipse would be your net gain, or if we were talking in purely business terms, it would be your profit, your total revenue minus your total cost. Let's go back and revisit this idea of diminishing marginal benefits and increasing marginal costs. Now, how am I going to explain this? Well, I'm going to explain this using beer and tacos. Why beer and tacos? Because I like beer and I like tacos. I'm from South Texas. Everybody likes beer and tacos. If you don't like beer, you like tacos. If you don't like tacos, you like beer. If you don't like beer and you don't like tacos, we're not going to be friends. You're not coming to the cookout. We like beer and tacos down here in South Texas. But anyway, how does that relate to marginal benefit and marginal cost? Let's talk about you. You've had a hard day at work. You worked so hard, you skipped lunch. You get off of work and you go to your favorite bar or you go to your favorite taqueria and you order that first taco. You order that first beer. And what happens when that first taco hits your lips and hits your stomach? It's an explosion of fat and protein and spices. Starts setting off a chain reaction in your head. You are feeling pleasure. Your body, your brain is designed as a pattern-seeking computer. And what it has is this little chemical called dopamine. And dopamine is the happy chemical. It's the reward chemical. So when you haven't eaten all day and you put a bunch of fat and protein in your body is programmed to go, hey, give them the happy chemical. They excite us. They interact with our prefrontal cortex and we get happier. We start thinking about flavor combinations that we enjoy and other meals we've had. And the aroma brings us back to when our grandmother used to cook this, and all kinds of things like that begin to happen. But you get happier. You get a lot happier. So early on in that total benefit graph, the jump as we go from one unit to the next unit to the next units, those jumps are pretty big. Same thing happens with the cold beer. You've worked all day, you're tired, you drink that cold beer, and things begin to happen. Alcohol produces dopamine in your brain. It's an addictive substance, makes you happier. You get a vasodilation effect. You feel warm all over. Starts to activate your stomach, make you hungrier. Now you want that taco. But the point is, you get a big jump in satisfaction after a long day of hard work and you get that first cold beer. But what happens when we have the second beer? What happens when we eat that second taco? Well, we get happier. One taco is great, two tacos is better. One beer is great, two beers is better. But do we get the same size jump in happiness that we got from going no tacos to one taco, that we got from going no beers to one beer? We don't. And there's a lot of reasons for this, but let's just make it biomedical. There is dopamine saturation. Your brain can only produce so much dopamine, and you've only got so many receptors for dopamine. As we start eating, we start plugging up those dopamine receptors. As we start drinking, we start plugging up those dopamine receptors. And so the next unit doesn't make us as happy as the first unit did. Now, overall, our happiness still goes up. Overall, our utility still goes up, but not by the same amount. And then that can be said for the third taco and the third beer and the fourth and the fifth and the sixth. Do you get happier? Do you receive more utility? Yes, you do. But is it as much utility? No, it's not. We call this the law of diminishing marginal utility. The more we consume something, the less marginal, the less incremental utility we receive. Now, this is true of everything. Literally everything is subject to the law of diminishing marginal utility. Don't believe me? Let's talk about money. Now, yes, you would sit there and say, well, a dollar has a set value, so a dollar must have the same utility as another dollar. It doesn't. Let's make it a little clearer. Let's say you make $30,000 a year, and I come along and I give you $10,000. Now, have I made a big change in your life? Have I made a big improvement in your life? Yes, I have. I've paid off your car loan, or maybe paid off your credit cards, or maybe sent you on a vacation that you've been wanting to take for years. I've done something for you. But what if you're rich? What if you make $30 million a year and I give you $10,000? What did I do for you? Buy you another first-class ticket to Europe? Buy you a new watch? I certainly didn't change your life for the good like I did the person who makes $30,000 a year. Even money has diminishing marginal utility. So hey, if you don't learn anything else from these series of economics videos, learn this. A dollar is worth more to a poor person than it is to a rich person. A dollar generates more utility in the hands of a poor person than it does in the hands of a rich person. Now let's talk about the other side of things. Let's talk about costs. Costs are accelerative. We have what we call increasing marginal cost. Back to the beer and tacos. What happens as we start eating tacos? Well, you eat one taco. You can digest that just fine. It's a little carbohydrates, a little protein, little fat, but you can digest that. But what happens when we start eating the second taco, the third taco, the fourth taco? Well, now we're not just converting that into ATP. Now we're not making energy for ourselves right now. It starts getting converted into fats for long-term storage. You eat a lot of tacos all the time, you get like me, you get fatter. Meanwhile, let's talk about alcohol. What happens as we accelerate uptaking alcohol? Well, the more we drink, the less we can process, the more damage it begins to do to our body, to our liver, etc. Also, you get fat. But it's not just that you get the same amount of fat. There's other costs that accelerate. What happens when you eat too many tacos? What happens when you eat taco 4, 5, 6, 7? You start to get indigestion. You start to get stomach problems, things that might last you into the next day. You're getting increasing marginal costs. Alcohol is even easier to understand. What happens when we drink too much? What happens when we go for beer 4, 5, 6, whatever your limit is? You start to get hungover the next day. And the more you drank, the worse that hangover becomes. So you start to get accelerating costs, not to mention the long-term physical ramifications of too much tacos or too much beer. So again, decreasing marginal benefits, plateauing the total benefit curve, increasing marginal costs, accelerating the total cost curve. Put that together. There is a gap between total benefit and total cost. That's net utility. That's net gain. That's profit. And what we'll talk about in a later lecture is how we mathematically determine where the optimal level of consumption is. All right. The next thing we need to talk about to understand economics is a concept that's a little more esoteric, But when we start talking about supply and demand and we start talking about price behavior in markets, we're going to need it. And that's the concept of ceteris paribus or caeteris paribus, depending on if you're on the Thucydides or Thucydides side of Greek pronunciation. I don't know, it's all Greek to me. Aha! Ceteris paribus literally means all else held constant, all other things the same. Now, what that means from our standpoint, the economy is made up of a lot of interconnected parts and pieces. We're going to start by building a model, and then we're going to see what happens when we move this piece or we move that piece. Here's the reality. All these variables in economics are related to each other. If you change one, you eventually change all of them. But that's very hard to model and very hard to understand. So we have ceteris paribus. What that means for us is when we say, okay, we're going to change this one variable, what happens, ceteris paribus? What we mean is, what is the immediate impact of that change? What is the first thing that changes? Not what are all the successive things that change, but what is the first change? In other words, you can think of ceteris paribus as a really smart mathematical way of saying, keep it simple, stupid. The reality is that in order to understand how these interconnected parts are moving, we need to move one part and see what the immediate impact is, and then move another part and see what the immediate impact is, and we build from there. Now, if you are wondering, yes, there are models that are not ceteris paribus models. The opposite of ceteris paribus is called mutatis mutandis. Everything changes all the time. And we don't do a lot of mutatis mutandis modeling in economics. Why? Because it's super complicated. Means you have to have some serious computing power to solve these things. We're talking access to supercomputers. And to be quite honest, economics isn't a field that gets all that much funding. We don't get access to all these top-of-the-line machines to run these models and see what happens. Now, if you're wondering, have I ever seen a mutatis mutandis model before? Yes, you have. Climatological models are mutatis mutandis models. To try to understand the climate, you're trying to understand so many things that are interconnected that you can't actually do ceteris paribus modeling. You have to do mutatis mutandis modeling. So all of our knowledge about global climate change actually comes from incredibly advanced, complex models that get solved using supercomputers. But as far as that relates to us, to economics, to these sets of videos that we're producing, we're going to stick in the ceteris paribus framework. We're going to keep things simple. We're going to say if A happens, then B happens. Not if A happens, then B happens, then B causes C, then C causes D, then D causes E, then E causes F. We're just going to look at, well, I made A happen, so B happened. So that's the framework we're going to work into. So when we start talking about supply and demand, we're going to keep it in the ceteris paribus framework to make things simple. Economics is a science. If we're going to say economics is a science, then we should take a moment to talk about what science actually is. Science is a product of the scientific method. The scientific method is a 5-step method for developing an empirical understanding of reality. The scientific method goes as follows. Step 1, observe the world around you. Look for cause and effect relationships that can be tested. Remember, our ultimate goal is to make something that can be replicated. So once we've got that, once we've made an observation of the world around us, we think we see a cause and effect relationship. We move on to step 2, hypothesizing. We make a hypothesis. Now, what is a hypothesis? A hypothesis is a statement of cause and effect that can be tested. If it can't be tested, it's not a hypothesis, and thus anything that follows after cannot be considered science. So when we talk about hypotheses, like we will talk about at some point, we will talk about the efficient markets hypothesis. Understand that we call it a hypothesis because we don't really have a way of testing it yet. So we've got this idea, it could in theory be tested, but nobody's really developed an experiment that can fully capture it yet. Once you've got your hypothesis, you can move on to step 3. Step 3, design and conduct an experiment to test your hypothesis. And here's where a lot of people get science wrong. When we design an experiment, we intentionally design an experiment to reject our hypothesis. Your goal in scientific experimentation is not to prove yourself right. It's to prove yourself wrong. And if we fail in proving ourselves wrong, we're showing evidence that, well, maybe we might be correct. But nonetheless, step 3, we design an experiment to test our hypothesis. This is where the rubber meets the road. When most people think of science, they tend to only think of step 3. But once you've conducted your experiment, you go to step 4. Step 4 is analyzing your results. When we test a hypothesis, what we do is we either reject the hypothesis, the experiment showed the hypothesis was not true, or we fail to reject the hypothesis. When we test hypotheses, we don't actually ever accept a hypothesis. We fail to reject it. And in failing to reject it, we provide some evidence that it might be true. And there is actually a third option. You do your experiment, you get your results, and you go, I learned something. And what you do is you go back to step 2 and you modify your hypothesis and you design a new experiment to test that modified hypothesis. To see if what you've learned from the first experiment can't then inform a second experiment to get greater information out of. But we analyze the results. And that's where we get into step 5. Step 5 is another part of science that a lot of people tend to forget about, and that's replication. One experiment testing one hypothesis and failing to reject that hypothesis is not the be-all, end-all. Science is meaningful because it's replicable, because one person can replicate the experiment of another or modify the experiment to test the same hypothesis. And then we start to build into science. Then we start to get something of real value. If I do an experiment and I fail to reject that hypothesis, and then you replicate that experiment and you fail to reject it, and then a third person modifies that experiment and they still fail to reject the hypothesis, now we've got compelling scientific evidence. And if a theory can be, or sorry, not a theory, and if a hypothesis stands up to continual independent testing, and it starts to become widely believed that this hypothesis is probably true, then that hypothesis raises up to the next level of knowledge. It becomes a theory. So let's put that out there right now. A theory is a hypothesis that has held up to continual independent verification. And this is where you just start to get on one of my personal bugaboos that's out there. The phrase, it's just a theory. Oh, really? It's just a thing that has independently been verified and is likely to be true? Now, this really starts to get your goat because you have a lot of people out there in the world that will claim something is a theory that isn't. Let's talk about 2 major theoretical conflicts that are out there using the definition of theory that we just laid out here and make it really simple. Creationism is not a theory. Creationism is not even a hypothesis. Now, it's not to say that science precludes the idea of the divine. But what's the nature of the divine? It can't be replicated. It doesn't repeat the same way every time. You can't hypothesize because you can't develop a statement of cause and effect that can be tested. Now let's look at the other side of things. Anthropogenic climate change. That is human activity, anthropogenic, arising from the human family. Climate change. Human activity is causing the world's climate to change. Absolutely solid theory. Something that has been tested and retested and modified and tested and retested and modified and tested and tested and remodified since the 1970s. And we've only ever come up with one result, that human activity and the creation of greenhouse gases is changing the composition of the Earth's atmosphere, of the Earth's oceans. It's leading to a shift in climate and its patterns. You might not like that theory. That might not sit well with you because of what a bunch of people said. Well, I believe this political philosophy, so this doesn't exist, even though there's scientific evidence for it. But we're not here to be politicians. Yes, am I laying out some controversial ideas here? To some, sure. But the reality is, in the world of science, they're not controversial. We have plenty of evidence for the theory of anthropogenic climate change. In fact, if you could prove that climate change was not being caused by human beings, ExxonMobil would drive dump trucks full of cash to the front of your house, and you could live on a mountain of $100 bills, gold, and diamonds. They've spent billions over the years trying to prove that climate change isn't real, and all their research shows that it is, and that it's anthropogenic in nature. The reality is science allows us to answer these questions through a method that requires independent verification. And so that's what we're here to talk about. The things I'm going to bring up over these series of videos, the concepts we're going to talk about, are things backed by scientific rigor. They actually are shown to be the way they are. So when I talk about a theory, you know that a theory is a hypothesis that's continually been independently retested and shown to likely to be true. Now, theory is not the be-all, end-all of science. Theories can rise to an even higher level. These are what we call laws or principles. An economic law is a theory that has held up to so much continual retesting that it actually starts to get integrated into other models. And those models hold up to testing. And then those models get integrated into other models, and those models hold up to testing. At some point, the theory becomes the basis for other theories. That theory becomes ingrained into the bedrock of the science itself, and it keeps holding up. So, you may have heard of things like the laws of thermodynamics. That's the same thing. Thermodynamics laws are so shown to be true that they become the basis for other theories in physics. And once something is a law, we no longer have to assume it's true. When you build a model, you have to say, assuming this theory holds, assuming that theory holds, that the model is going to behave according to those theories. But when you build with laws, you don't have to say, well, what's going to happen to the pressure in this storage vat for crude oil, assuming the laws of thermodynamics hold? You just do it holding the laws of thermodynamics to be true. And in economics, we're going to talk about things like the law of demand, the law of supply. We already talked about one, the law of diminishing marginal utility. These are things that have risen out of being hypotheses to being evidence to being theories and then rising to one more level beyond that. So when you see the word law in a science context, that is a theory that has so much proof that we can just take it as true. And our last topic for today is directly related to economics as a science, and that's the concept of normative versus positive. Now, normative and positive are very important things to understand when we talk about economics, because the type of economics you're doing can be very different. Positive economics, a positive statement, comes from the root word posit, to put forth as an idea. A positive statement is an objective statement, a statement that can be proven true or false. Doesn't necessarily have to be true, but it has to be something that we can prove true or false. So an example of a positive statement would be, the sky is blue. Now, we can define blue as a certain wavelength of light. We could get a device to measure the wavelength of light. We could point that device at the sky. We could define blue as a certain frequency or wavelength of light radiation. And we could test it whether the light coming back was indeed blue in color. So we can test whether the sky is blue or not. Now, obviously, true statement, the sky is a shade of blue, usually, unless it's night or it's going to rain or something like that. But the sky is blue is still a positive statement. Another example of a positive statement would be that 1% of Americans control the majority, that is 50% plus 1, of America's wealth. Now, that is not a true statement. 32.1% of the wealth of all of America is controlled by the top 1% of income earners. It's a false statement, but it's still objective. We could prove it true or false. On the other hand, we have normative statements. Normative statements are statements that imply moral value or moral judgment. They are statements about what the norm should be. So if I said the sky in Texas is beautiful, that's subjective. That's in the eye of the beholder, right? Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. So that's entirely based on your opinion and your standards of beauty. I would say the sky in Texas is beautiful. You may think otherwise. However, it's a normative statement. Another example of a normative statement. It is unfair and immoral that 1% of Americans control so much of America's wealth. Again, it's a value judgment. That's a subjective statement. Now, this brings us to normative and positive economics. Positive economics is focused on the objective. So that would include things like theoretical economics, where we build and model things. It would include empirical economics, where we gather data to show statistical relationships. And then there's normative economics. Normative economics is about building things based on what things should be. Based on this set of beliefs, this is what the ideal economy would look like. Or based on this set of beliefs, this is what that ideal economy would look like. What I'm here to do, what we're here to do, is to talk about positive economics and positive things. Things we can objectively show to be true. Things that are pretty well investigated with scientific rigor. Now, that doesn't mean that the broader world doesn't politicize things or attempt to politicize things that are facts. See our previous discussion about creationism and climate change. But here's the deal and the promise that I make. I'm going to teach you the positive. I'm going to teach you the objective. I'm going to teach you that which we know to be true. And how you choose to use those facts based on your subjective moral beliefs is your business. My business is making sure that you have an objective understanding of reality, that you have an objective understanding, a positive understanding of economics. So that's what this channel's here for positive economics. All right, that's going to do it for today, y'all. Remember, we're doing this for free. All we ask is that you like, that you comment, that you subscribe, particularly give us comments, give us feedback so we've got ideas about what you want to see on the channel. Follow us on all the socials. Links will be somewhere on the screen at some point. And I'll see y'all next time.